I wrote the script in 6 days, but that's very unusual for me. Believe me, scripts are very difficult to write, actually, especially if there's an original one. This is an adaptation, but even then, that can take a long time. But the reason it went so beautifully is because the book just had a wonderful cinematic core with the most amazing dialogue, and I really basically spent 3 days transcribing the dialogue just by itself to see what it felt like. Was this a movie? And when I looked at it, I thought, it is a movie. And the next 3 days I spent filling in the descriptions of the scenes that went with the dialogue, and I had a script. And that's the script we shot with. He knew it was good when we sent it to him, and it was the kind of thing he wanted to do, something quite different from Twilight, because he's done that. It scared him, but he knew that being scared was a good thing when you're an actor. If you just play it safe, you might have a nice comfy career, but if that's all you want, then that's fine. But if you're serious about being an actor, then you want to get to the edges of what you can do. And certainly this is a very edgy Rob Pattinson we see in this movie. I mean, of course, when somebody decides to play a villain, that's different. They love that. They want, villainy is great to play, and you accept that you're being the villain, and therefore you can be as nasty as possible. And it's very cathartic for an actor to do that. But when you're the lead of the movie, who's not exactly a villain, then you could have an actor who's worried about not being appealing, not being kind enough, or not being, not sensitive enough on screen. And that never came up with us. I mean, it never really was an issue. It was sort of, how do you get the best, most interesting angles on Eric, this very unusual guy, a sort of a recently iconic kind of guy, because he's a mid-20s billionaire, and there are a lot of those around these days, what with the internet, billionaires emerging in the last couple of decades. And so things that didn't happen before have happened now. And what does that do to you as a person, to have that kind of success and that kind of power when you're that young and immature? Therefore, not necessarily an attractive character. Of course, he has to be attractive dramatically. The one thing would be bad if this character were not watchable, if you weren't interested in him, if you weren't interested in seeing what he does. And that, of course, is part of the casting. I mean, Rob is incredibly watchable, incredibly charismatic, and that's the card we were playing, rather than the isn't he sweet, likable guy kind of card. The novel, in some ways, is very, very much New York. In some other ways, it's kind of universal and prescient, really, because it was written in around the year 2000, and it's absolutely fresh right now, 11 years later, in terms of its understanding of where the world was going with the economic crisis and the Wall Street meltdown and all of that stuff. I mean, it was pretty much predicted completely in this book. So is it really about New York, or is it more about the world of financing in general, and how specific do you have to get in terms of New York? And gradually, I felt less and less like I had to shoot it in New York City. Wall Street is mentioned and so on, but Wall Street in a generic term, meaning the world of high finance. So I really got to feel that it was not generic, not a generic city that we're in, but a mythological, iconic city, which didn't need to be specifically New York. It sounds like a total cop-out, but I don't think it is. I think it really works for the movie. So literally, you could be in Toronto. It could take place in Toronto, and that was the decision, was to shoot it in Toronto. Yes, we will shoot some background plates that are specific to New York. Yes, the streets will have New York street signs and license plates. But we are not obsessive about where we are in New York. We're in the limo. I talked to the actors. I didn't want them to be surprised, by the fact that so much of the movie takes place in a limo, and for most of the characters, their scenes are totally inside the limo. And I jokingly said it's my version of Das Boot, which is a movie that takes place totally in a submarine. And I also actually watched and encouraged everybody to watch the movie Lebanon, which is an Israeli film that takes place entirely inside of a tank, a battle tank, because we had some of the same issues. Of course, the limo is a set, and it had to be modular and come apart so that we could shoot from many different angles and so on. But it also meant that I could not really be in the limo with my actors, and therefore I would talk to them. I would listen over headphones, and I would talk to them with a microphone coming out of a speaker. And so I was always watching what they were doing on a monitor. And yes, it was like the voice of God. They would suddenly be shocked when I said, I don't think you should do that. Don't stop picking your nose. It would,
I met Don DeLillo 3 or 4 years ago in Estoril, and because I have a small festival in Estoril where I put artists discussing about films and cinema, and Don was there, and I love all his work. And when I read Cosmopolis 3 or 4 years ago, I really thought that it was a very cinematographic book, and I asked him if the rights were free, and he told me, Paul, if you want, I can let you try to do a movie out of that. And for the first time that I read the book, I thought this is really for David Cronenberg. The first impression that David says, I like very much what Don is doing, but usually I don't accept propositions like that. I have a lot of projects, At that time I had a project with Tom Cruise. Other ones, on Dangerous Method, and I don't think I can do. But I say, okay, I have the book. I let you the book. Let's see. And 48 hours afterwards, he called me and said, Paul, it's for me. I want to do it. I start writing the script, and you just have to call my agent. And it was the easiest contract I ever made. And he said, it's exactly what I want to do, and I was pretty, I was really amazed but really happy that with this reaction of David, and everything started there. It's a book completely prophetic, and that's, Don is known by that, that you wrote a book about, that the two Twin Towers will come down, and they just came down just 2 or 3 years afterwards, and it's like a prophetic, the way that Don sees the world, with this such sauvagerie, like they say the French. That is something that is makes it such a modern, vision, and at the same time so terrible, but at the same time so what you can say, so close to reality that is now, and with all this, playing games with the world finances and everything.
There are all kinds of tensions in the film, and one of them, of course, is that the story takes place over the course of a single day, during a single limousine ride across the center of Manhattan. On the other hand, the car is constantly stuck in traffic. So while Eric's trying to make headway physically and perhaps emotionally, he's constantly frustrated by the flow of traffic, by the invasion of people, his wife, his mistress, his doctor, his co-workers, Mathieu Amalric, you know, the character of Petrescu, the pie-throwing anarchist, the rat people, the Brother Fez's funeral, and then finally and ultimately Benno. We're very excited that the casting for this film, particularly Robert Pattinson in the lead role of Eric Packer, is going to bring the film to a new generation of Cronenberg aficionados, I think. People who might not otherwise have gone to see a Cronenberg film because they're the films that simply belong to a generation before them, you know, films that their parents might love. And so Rob's really invigorated the filmmaking process by bringing a really youthful sense, not just to the character of Eric Packer, but also to the rest of the cast.
I'd read the script, I think, a year before and thought it was amazing, and just had, you know, I think someone had just sent me for interest, and I was interested in it, but I think there are other people attached, and I also thought I was too young, and I don't know, it was at a point in, I was doubting myself quite a lot, and I was thinking, I'd never get offered something like that. And then out of the blue, last year, it kind of came out of nowhere, saying like, yeah, do you want to do it? And I was kind of amazed, and had no idea how I was going to play it, but I like all of David's movies a lot, and it seemed like a no-brainer to do it. One strange thing about it, because you're in a car for the majority of the time, there's no camera operator really right there watching you, and he's outside of the car and he's just working on an intercom, so you can't really be that hands-on. But he's just incredibly sensitive to every little thing you're doing, and to the point where sometimes you don't even really know what you're doing, you just kind of had a feeling about it, and he always seemed to pick up on when things were interesting, which is very reassuring. It's all you kind of really want from a director. For a very dialogue-heavy script, and also kind of surreal, I mean, you could go anywhere with it, and so any constants or any kind of foundation that you can have helps. And so if everything was set in different scenes and you could move around everywhere, I mean, I would literally have been going completely loopy. But just having to stay in the seat the whole time, it really it forces you to behave a certain way. And it was nice as well having the other actors come in every single time, and none of them were ever as familiar as I was, apart from Jay Baruchel, who was doing it on the first day with me. After that point, no one had been in the limo as much as me. So they came in and had to figure it all out for themselves, and I was always comfortable in my seat, and they could just observe whatever they were doing to figure out their performances, which was nice. I mean, everyone else felt alien in my domain.
The script is very dense. There's so much allegory and metaphor, and there's just so much behind the actual script that I read the script a whole bunch of times, and I did a lot of note taking and trying to understand where Elise kind of fit into the plot, and I started, reading a lot of Sylvia Plath and Emily Dickinson, and kind of understanding maybe where she's coming in terms of her views and her feelings as a poet, which I think is really kind of important to her, because I think that Elise has this kind of veneer of an Upper East Side Manhattan woman, but underneath she's very much an intellectual and very much an artist, and I think that it's the tension between those two aspects of her that creates, a really interesting character. There is obviously, the sexual tension between her and Eric, and I think they've been married for 22 days, and I think that they're really in a process of getting to know each other through the course of the film, and I think that with each meal is like a process of courting, and you kind of get to see this arc in their relationship. I think that's what's so interesting about David's casting for the film. I know that originally he was casting the project older, and then I think to cast Rob younger and then myself is, I think it's more interesting in the sense that if they were older, they should just know better, really. And I think because they're young and they have all this power and money and attention on them, it just kind of creates more of an interesting reason for them to make the choices that they make in the course of the film.
I am playing the role of Torval, who I am Eric's chief of security / guardian / biatch. He gets paid very well to protect one of the wealthiest men in the world, but he kind of puts me in tough predicaments, and so it's a little frustrating. In a way, I kind of feel a little fatherly. You know, I question his decisions, but you know, like any father with an adult son, you can't make decisions for them. You can only try to guide them the right way and provide them with information, and then they make their own decisions. And I feel like I'm doing that through the whole film, and he never really takes my advice. So it's, you know, maybe my dad feels that way with me too.
Shiner and Eric started the company together sort of back in the day, but I guess they're two halves of the same brain in a way, I think, and whereas I think Eric is quite sort of definitive, and even though he's so existential, he's far more comfortable. I think Shiner's really much more at the mercy of his friend and the world at large, and just someone that thinks a lot and analyzes everything constantly. And he's just like, yeah, he's one of the .com kids, you know, a slacker that became a millionaire. All I've ever wanted to do since I was a little kid was to write and direct horror movies in Canada, and he is someone who's done that, and he's someone that's proved you can be an auteur and have a definitive voice and be Canadian and not have to be exported. And so I've taken ownership of all his movies. And I remember the first time I saw Videodrome when I was 13 years old, and it just hijacked my imagination. And you know, and he's sort of also, he's the exception that makes the rule, in that unfortunately, as a fan of music or movies or writers or anything, you live to see your favorites lose it, lose their whatever they have inside them, the fire, the spark. They get crappy, they get their balls cut off, and whatever it is. And he seems to just be hitting his stride. You know, it's like Eastwood. He's only getting better.
When I read the scene, I thought it'd be fun to be part of it, you know, and this is such a crazy idea to have this man in this limo. It's so kind of metaphysical. And it feels to me when we were shooting, I mean, we're almost finished now, that, you know, there's, at the beginning it was kind of, you know, yeah, we're having, you know, best time in a limo. And then afterwards, at the end of the scene, it feels like, what? This kind of feeling of emptiness. My character is kind of giggling and kind of playing with him. At the same time, she's jealous. At the same time, she has money to make with his business thing. And then this kind of descending that she feels alone. She feels not part of the world anymore. She doesn't have, it seems that she doesn't have a love life. She doesn't have a real life somehow. So this feeling of losing, of being lost, is I find it kind of interesting to play. How to imagine also a scene of 5 pages, you know, in a space small like this. It was kind of challenging because David wanted Robert to be in the same spot always, like in this powerful position of sitting in front of his limo, and I'm like bouncing from one place to another and entertaining him almost. So that was fun to do.
Well, I played Jane Melman, and I am Eric's chief of finance, as well as a single struggling mother who has been called in on her one day off to come into his limo in the middle of New York and have this kind of crazy experience with him. What he brings to it, I think, that to me is quite genius, is this teenage aspect of Eric. And not in the sense that he is he's not a teenager, but that he has that kind of adolescence about him. When Robert says the words, I think that sense of that he could say it anyway and it comes out kind of spectacular is because of this youthful daring in him.
Via is Eric Packer's chief of theory, so she's a theorist. Therefore, I see her as incredibly intellectual, very cerebral, but also incredibly cold and quite distant. By saying this, it doesn't mean that I've had a terrible time. I've had an amazing time. However, the environment with which we were shooting in was the most difficult I've ever shot in. People say, oh, what was it like being in all that water for Minority Report and the camera coming up and down? And it was fine. It was water. It was fine. There's something to do with the claustrophobia of being in a car, the heat of the lights, the people on the car. You feel like you're at a safari and the monkeys are jumping on the car, and you know, and you're like, oh, they're going to get in. But then ultimately to stay in character, because she's not fazed by it at all, whereas, you know, it was tricky.
My character's name is Brother Fez. He's a Sufi rapper who is very influential to people. People adore him, and he is kind of like a bit of a reflective, spiritual sort of a musician. No doubt it will have to be from something from within me that this music comes from. And I wonder if it's informed by a feeling from a character, a script, an idea, that what it will be like. I mean, that's the first time I'm doing that, so we'll see. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing it. It's challenging, and it's nice for me to be challenged by it, because I'm very used to just doing my own thing and my own music, but this is cool. This is a good way to approach music and see if it may even inform what I do.
What is funny is that cream pies, to cream pies, is something that comes from silent films. And in this scene, this guy talks so much. So it's funny to have something that comes from silent movies, but with so much text. I think this film will say something absolutely terrible on the times we are living. There is something between the people that have power in a car that doesn't see the world, and what is collapsing all around, that is a metaphor that only Cronenberg, I think, could grab. So with an accurate and very funny but scary, it's a scary film.
They're very truthful things coming out of the mouth of somebody who's very irrational, who's been pushed beyond some sort of limit. And so it makes it tricky to take it in, because you're getting something from a crazy person. He is crazy, but lots of it makes sense, unfortunately. I mean, there's lots of very kind of uncomfortable truths about things that he's saying. And so yes, I do like him as much as you can like anybody in this movie, you know? I mean, yes, and in some ways I guess he's sort of the most, oddly again for the audience, besides the character that Robert plays, who is relatable in a weird way if you can get there, that I suppose he's sort of relatable in some ways, even though he's crazy. Well, it's an interesting thing that they left this to the last. It's the last thing. He lands in here. We'd never met each other before, and I was a little bit like, oh, we don't get to rehearse, we don't get to meet each other. In some ways, it was good. Yeah, no, and I also think the fact that we couldn't be more different physically is great. I mean, it's like two guys who are really, really different from each other, and but no, it's been really, and it's such an oblique, enigmatic conversation, but doing it with him does not feel, it feels very connected, which is important for the scene. Yeah. No, he's really, really good. I've really enjoyed working with him.